Salvete omnes, welcome to this week's video tutorial. This will be the last chapter that we introduce, practice, and learn for the semester. Let's take a look at chapter 28, and the topic is the subjunctive. And the subjunctive, or rather the subjunctive in English is often called the conditional. And as you will read, the subjunctive or conditional is about contrary to factual conditions. So instead of saying that we are having class online, that is indicative. But of course, we are not having Latin class online, we're having it remotely. So we would say if we were having Latin in class, many of the elements that we have discussed might be easier to explain in person rather than remotely. So you can see the verbs in that example are used conditionally or subjunctively in the case of Latin. We are talking about verbs. In my experience, some students still confuse nouns and verbs. Remember, nouns have declensions or parts of speech and cases in the case of Latin. So we have the nominative or the subject case, the accusative or the direct object, the dative or the indirect object, and so on and so forth. And of course, those are our declension endings, which are so crucial for learning Latin, are a, I, arm, is, us, o, o, arm, is, os, is, and so on. With the subjunctive, we are of course talking about verbs. So here it talks about expressing a verbal action or a state of being. So please read this and study the examples before going on to the exercises. There is a, I think, helpful mnemonic device to remember the key vowel or spelling for the subjunctive. And as your book points out, it's we fear a liar. And you will see that, even though this is a little bit blurry just based on the Kindle format, that laudare is a first conjugation verb that normally has a as its key vowel. But here we are substituting e as the key vowel. Second conjugation, normally it's e as the key vowel in the indicative. Here we're going to use ea. So again, the format makes it a little less intuitive, but your book has a clear format on this point. So we have ea, but then a, and then ia, and if we look at that together, there's we fear a liar. So e is first conjugation subjunctive. ea is second conjugation subjunctive. A is third conjugation subjunctive. So for example, ago, agere, egi, actum is normally the letter E, but here it's the letter A. And then both the fourth and the 3-4 so-called capio verbs use IA as the signpost or spelling, if you will. So I think that's helpful for recognizing the subjunctive, because we will need to translate it in the subjunctive or conditional and not in the indicative. And again, all this is clearly explained in the introductory remarks of this chapter. Another thing to note is that in English, we tend not to use the conditional as much as in Latin. And also our translation tends to be somewhat more idiomatic, whereas Latin requires a little bit more precision. Perhaps even thinking about British English, as you will see. If you can think British English, in my experience, you'll have a little bit more success both in understanding and translating the subjunctive. There are two kinds of subjunctive clauses in this chapter that we need to learn. As you can see, as we mentioned earlier, Latin uses the subjunctive a lot more than English. There's different kinds of clauses that need to be learned, but we don't need to worry about those this semester. The two in this chapter are the usive subjunctive, and if we turn the page here, purpose clauses. Once again, when you read the material in this chapter, you'll see the difference. Usive is basically giving a command, and we'll have to translate it accordingly. And indeed, the word let, as your book points out, although it sounds like formal English, it's the best way to be most successful with this topic. So when you have a usive subjunctive, use let as the way to translate it. Purpose clauses, as you can see, there's many ways to translate it. In short, the preposition to, or in order to, or so that, in my experience, are the three ways to translate that you need to keep in mind, because we do need an idiomatic translation. But again, this is all clearly spelled out in the chapter. So please read this a couple times, as we've often said, and then study the examples many, many times, and refer to them while you're working your way through the chapter. Excuse me. That's the advice I have for you. Of course, we have vocabulary that you'll also need to learn, because this vocabulary will be tested. And also, it's important for the sententia antiqui that we are doing in this chapter. So with all that said, as we've said many times, you need to review and preview this content before going on to the exercises. But once you do that, you're going to turn your attention to the exercises. Now again, when in doubt, you look up the words. It's no different than research, or in the hard sciences, language studies is no different. You got to take your time, not just guess. So if we're in doubt here, if we just type in this right here, you can see that Ducat is giving us information here, Whitaker's words, that is present active subjunctive third person singular. Third person normally is E as the key vowel, but because it's A, going back to we fear a liar, we have A as the vowel, indicating that we need to use the subjunctive in this case. Notice that the present subjunctive still uses osmos tisnet as its person and number endings. So in this case, it's third person singular. He, she, or it. So please use Whitaker's words. I used it a lot when I was learning Latin. I still occasionally use it to both teach and to look up words that are less commonly used, just to confirm the grammar. So we go back to this, Ratio ducat non fortuna, Livy, the Roman historian. This actually is the subject in this case, so we need to recognize reason, ratio, as the subject. So let reason, not fortune, lead. So you can see the verb is doing work for both clauses here. So you could change the word order. You could say, let reason lead, not fortune. That also would work. Or as I just said, you could say, let reason, not fortune, lead. And so that one's fairly straightforward. It's a nice, clear example of the conditional in Latin. Notice how using let is clearly the way to go. Otherwise, you may have trouble translating it. In English, we often use if or when, but we don't have the conjunctions for that in Latin. So, and then you would require something that clearly doesn't quite fit the Latin. So in English, you might say, we should follow, or if we were to let reason, not fortune, lead us, yada, yada, yada. And you can see already right there that English requires a little bit longer sentence, whereas Latin, because Latin uses the conditional a lot more than English, Latin can say in 4 words, which in the case of English might require many, many words. So using let, L-A-T, as your book points out, is the way to translate the use of subjunctive, giving some kind of order or command or some kind of imperative. In English, we often describe this element of the conditional as wishes. When you wish something to be the case or wish something to be true, we would use the conditional form of wishing or the meaning of wishing in the case of English. But other than that, you can see the vocabulary and the grammar is fairly simple, and it's a very short sentence. Speaking of short sentences, the next one is fairly short, any shorter than this. We need to recognize that arma is a neuter noun in the plural, and hence agrees with the verb. This one, I believe, is one of the vocabulary words, and you can see that normally quero, quedere, cesi, cessum is a 3rd conjugation verb, hence the letter E, indicating it as 3rd conjugation. Well, we said we fear a liar is our key signpost here, if you will. So A, the letter A, is what we're going to use for 3rd conjugation verbs. So this tells us, because it's in the letter A, not E, that we have the subjunctive here. And what we have is let. We're going to use let again, L-A-T. Let arms fall to the toga. Or let arms yield to the toga. In other words, peace, not war. So that one is fairly straightforward. Notice that to the toga is first declension dative singular. I. So there's our AE. So there's a good opportunity to review your declension endings. All right, so moving on to number 3. Here we have, as your book points out, the subjunctive is a mood. Here we have another mood, namely the imperative, going back to chapter 1, I believe. So discede means to leave or to depart. So what we have here, again, this is Cicero, probably in the context of Catiline and other conspirators, and he's telling him to leave now while you can. And leave now from the city, lest I be repressed or suppressed by fear and arms. So let me go over that again, and I'll try to explain it. Leave, so discede, so 2nd person singular imperative, leave now from the city, and of course the city in question is Rome, lest, L-E-S-T, I am suppressed by fear and arms. Now that translation sounds a little bit abstract, but that is the sense of it. And let me try to explain that in fuller detail. What makes this a little bit tricky is the last clause here. So the first part I think is fairly straightforward. Leave now from the city. So that one, ex urbe nunc discede. But these last 4 words, we use ne to introduce a negative. And your book points out there's different ways to translate the ne. Let's see, where is this here? Here we go, ne. Here's the ne as well, using not. Now, when I was learning Latin, again, a lot of our learning is habits. So I learned Latin in England. So British English would just say lest, L-E-S-T. Obviously, in American English, that sounds a little bit too formal, even Shakespearean. But notice how lest, L-E-S-T, which is still a word in American English, I think is easier because it's one word, but it perhaps sounds a little bit too formal for some of you. So you can just use not, but then you have to figure out how to translate it so that it still is idiomatic or sounds like decent language. So I guess in this case, leave now from the city so that I am not suppressed, if you follow that right there, by fear and arms. Notice that Metuit armies are both in the ablative. So Metu is fourth declension ablative singular, and armies is armis is first declension ablative plural. Now the sense of it, of course, is that I'm afraid that you're going to cause more harm to the Republic, and I will be forced, because Cicero was the consul during the Catiline conspiracy, had some power over the military, and so he's telling Catiline and his conspirators that because he was a senator, he was basically giving him an out, that leave now lest I may be forced to do something against you and your band of cronies that may be necessary. So that's the sense of it. So again, you're going to have to experiment with different ways to translate these clauses, and that's why reading the examples, as I've said a couple times already, in fact numerous times, is helpful, because it'll give you a little more confidence that there's more than one way to do it, but there's not 1,000 ways. And so generally, if there's more than one way to do it, you're looking at 2 or 3 ways at most, and you just have to choose one that works. Life is like sports. If you want to strike somebody out, there's different kinds of fastballs. It's not just one kind of fastball. All right, moving on to number 4. Here we have Terence, who again tends to be somewhat of a comedian, although sometimes that humor may not come out in these solo sentences. This one's interesting because we do have some fairly complex or advanced grammar in this chapter. Rhetore facienda is the gerundive, which we had earlier in the semester, and so that's going to be tricky. Habeam, we need to recognize that this is the verb in the subjunctive, and then we have just some vocabulary that may be less familiar, like protinos is an adverb meaning immediately. But then we have the ut, which is one of the grammar elements in this chapter, indicating a purpose clause. So grammatically, this one is fairly not complex, but it's going to require some explanation, understanding, and memory in order to be successful with it and feel confident that you understand it. As is often the case, that we need to know the vocab first. So you at home, this is what I did, and I still do it. We need to get the vocab first. So let's go ahead and make sure we know the vocab as a kind of rough first draft translation. So then you have something like this. Now one thing to me immediately is to be done, so that great leisure and solace I have. So with that, we probably have some sense of what's going on here, but now we need to, of course, put it in a way that sounds good in English. And probably what we're going to do right here is that now this one thing. So una res means now this one thing, literally now one thing. Now this one thing is to be done immediately. Is to be done immediately. And then probably by me. So in other words, now I have to do this one thing immediately. But notice how the Latin, the grammar is a little bit different than that English version. So now this one thing must be done immediately by me, so that I have the greatest peace and solace. So the ut is the key grammar element in this one. And as I pointed out in passing earlier, as I was scrolling to the Sententia Antiqui, the ut is used for purpose. And you can see there's many ways to translate a purpose clause in Latin. All of these are equally acceptable. The shortest is to, so that, or in order to. So using, even that works, but I would recommend using either to, in order to, or so that as kind of your stock 3 options. So we go back to the example here now with all that information at our disposal. I think it makes a little bit more sense. All right, moving on to number 5. Of course, Horace is famous for carpe diem, seize the day. Even those who don't know any Latin have probably heard that expression. Here is another version of it by Horace, because that was one of the big themes in all of his writings. And here, so again, let me go back to, let's say you don't know rapiamos. So if I go back to Whitaker's Words, I just look it up here, but let me actually do a couple things here. So rapio, if I just put in the present tense, notice that it is 3rd conjugation. How do we know that? Because E is the key vowel. So we need to recognize this as a verb of the 3rd conjugation, which we have here. But of course, this would give us the present indicative active first person singular. We don't have that. We have something that is spelled a little bit differently, so we have to be able to recognize that. And of course, Whitaker's Words is a great tool for that. Now we have the present active subjunctive. But the reason I looked up both of these words for us is notice how E becomes IA, because if we go back to that mnemonic device, we fear a liar. No, excuse me. This one, let's see. It's early in the morning for me, at least. Yeah. Well, that one doesn't. So, be almost. Oops. I can type now. That this tells us it's present active subjunctive first person plural. So if we go back to the example here, there we are, is we're going to use let. This is where let actually works very well. So let us, so the Whitaker's Words actually, I'm surprised, this is actually a, in this case, a 3-4 copio conjugation in this particular case. So that's why we have the IA here. So let us take, my friends, or let us take, friends, the occasion from the day. So this one's a lot easier than I sort of bumbled in my explanation, but just let us take, because we have the first person plural subjunctive. And then here we just have the vocative. Let us take my friends or friends. And then here, occasion is 3rd declension. So 3rd declension accusative singular is EM. So blank is EMA. And then literally from the day, day is always, DE is always followed by the ablative. Day, of course, is 5th declension. So 5th declension ablative singular, if you look on your declension sheet, which again you should have next to you at all times for the nouns, you can see is the letter E with the macron. So we put all together is that let us take, my friends, the occasion from the day, which is another way of saying carpe diem, seize the day, take advantage of living, quite frankly, not just opportunities, but of living. All right, number 6. Here we have Seneca, so we should know by now this is probably some theme in Stoicism. And sure enough, the body has certain needs, but the soul is distinct from the body, and hence Stoicism develops that idea time and again of a kind of dualism in human nature. So let's take a look at this one here. Now here we have this verb eget, which I believe is one of the vocabulary words. There it is. And so with this particular verb, you can see it requires the ablative as its object. So we got to sort of keep, you'll see that the example has words in the ablative. And to translate it, we need either need, lack, or want. And once again, you have to kind of decide which one, based on the context, makes the most sense. So this one, there's two things we got to keep in mind. One, how to translate it, and two, that it's going to require the ablative or even the genitive, which I believe in this case it is the ablative, but it just depends. So we'll go back to our example. Is einem means for. I think that was all going all the way back to chapter 1. For the body, in this case, needs. And then sure enough, somno is somnus, which means sleep, which is first declension ablative singular. So us, e, o. And many other things. In order to be well. Literally, so that it may be well. So here's our purpose clause, and then this is our valere is second conjugation, I believe. So there's our EA. We fear a liar. There's the EA right there. So putting it all together, going up to the semicolon, this first clause, for the body, needs sleep and many other things to be well, or in order to be well, or so that it may be well. As we saw, there's many ways to translate ut as a purpose clause with our verb in the subjunctive. The animus could mean either mind or soul, probably in this case the mind, or the mind itself, or the mind nourishes itself, or the soul nourishes itself. Here we have kind of a double intensifier. We have reflexive pronoun se, and then ipse, kind of really emphasizing just how distinct the animus is from the corpus. Because it would be grammatically correct just to say animus se alit, so we wouldn't really need the ipse if not for rhetorical emphasis. So you can see this one, you can certainly, just as in English, use verbs in the subjunctive, but here we have a verb in the indicative. So we can mix moods in language, and here's a good example of that. Number 7, qui beneficium Dei taciat naret quia cepit. So we have Seneca, another, well, not another, but we just read an idea from him just a moment ago, so we should have a similar idea of some moral disposition towards life. So whoever, literally whoever gave a gift, he or she should be silent. Whoever receives should talk. You can see how in English we often use should or would. But if we use, I think we need to follow the advice given in Wheelock, and let's go back to let as the key idea here. So dedit, so if we go back to dodari dedi datum, so qui, let's go back to, just to kind of walk through some of this here. So this one, you can see dodari dedi datum is first conjugation. So we're going to need the letter E, because we and we fear a liar indicates that it is in the subjunctive. If it were in the subjunctive, but in this case, it isn't. So whoever gives a gift, let him be quiet. whoever receives a gift, beneficium, let him talk. Naret, naare is first conjugation, so there's the letter E that we were talking about earlier. So we replace the A with an E, and it's the same thing here. Takre is third conjugation, so we need the EA because we fear. No, actually, this is second conjugation because it's EA, right? Takre, we fear a liar. Let's see, that should be the case. Let me look this up myself just to make sure here. So if I type in, yeah, so if I just put in the present tense, you can see it's second conjugation. So sure enough, second conjugation, the E becomes an EA, because that is the rule for the subjunctive. So we can double check that. Second person, present active subjunctive. So there we go. Number 9, here was some Diogenes. We don't have much of him in this book. Nice to have this for a change. Literally, about the dead, nothing except good, let us speak. So dicere is, dico is third conjugation. So just if we look that up here, so you can see that this is the one that we need to look at. E is third conjugation. Well, third conjugation in the subjunctive requires IA, because the letter A, we fear a liar. So we need the letter A. So sure enough, we have the letter A here, not the letter E. So the letter A tells us it is in the subjunctive. So let us speak nothing except good about the dead. So let us speak, dicamos, nothing, nisi, good, bonum, or literally nothing except good, nihil nisi bonum, and then this is our object, about the dead. As we mentioned earlier, day is always followed by the ablative, so second declension ablative plural is is, is. Moving on here, number 9, parens ipsine habeat vitia nec toleret. So here we have Quintilian, one of the church fathers and also an important educator in the ancient world. Is, let's see, a parent. So this is a parent. A parent himself neither should have nor tolerate vices. Now this is one where it does seem more natural. When I say natural, just happened spontaneous for me to use should. But again, I think we want to use let. It's just the way to go in Latin. Once we start using different verbs, which I think it's pointed out here at some point. Let's see here. Once we start using different verbs like may, should, and there's other ones that it just becomes more complex. So we want to keep it, I think, simple, especially when you're learning something. The simpler the better. So let's keep it simple. Let's use let. I know that may seem a little bit unidiomatic in terms of American English, but it's definitely the way to go. Oops. Okay. So let a parent himself, neither have vices nor tolerate vices. So let, because we have the subjunctive here, let a parent himself neither have, so habeat means let have. Let a parent himself neither have vices. Vices is second declension, neuter plural. so letter A, nor tolerate vices. So tolerate also is in the subjunctive, and we can verify that because normally it's first conjugation, but A becomes E when we have the subjunctive. So that is an example of the use of subjunctive where we're giving a command or some kind of strong request. And as an educator, that's what Quintilian was certainly trying to do. Number 10, Dachem. Literally, in this matter, reason to have is in order, admonition with acerbity to not have. So this one also is a little bit tricky just because we have this verb and then we have the gerundive. So grammatically this one has elements in Latin grammar that we don't have in English grammar, and so we have to be a little bit more creative with our reading and translation. So what do we have here? So in this matter, reason is to have. So in this matter, reason is to be had, so that the admonition is not without acerbity. The idea here, which may be counterintuitive, that Cicero was a rationalist, and so the idea that for him, something rational, it was intuitive, that it had moral purpose or value. For us, perhaps not so much so, but that's the idea behind it. So with that idea in mind, the Latin becomes a little bit easier to understand. So in this matter, reason is to be had. In other words, if you use reason, then the admonition, what is an admonition? It's a kind of reminder that someone either is or is not doing the right thing. Then the admonition will not be without acerbity. Acerbity means power or force of moral persuasion. So these are words in English that you can look up if you're not quite sure. So we put all together. So in this matter, reason is to be had, so that the admonition is not without acerbity. A little bit abstract. That's just because for us moderns, moral reason is less intuitive than it was for Romans and Christians. Number 11. Normally we do 10, but we'll do the last two just because they're actually pretty famous lines in Latin literature. Feminae ad ludo semper variunt et ut ipsae variantur. Here we have Ovid, and he's saying that women always come to the games so that they may be seen, and so that they themselves may be seen. So women always come to the games. So semper, he's talking about like the Circus Maximus or gladiatorial games, so that they may be seen. Now this is somewhat brilliant because Ovid as a poet is sort of playing upon that it's not reality or veniunt that most people live their lives, but a kind of wish fulfillment, a kind of fantasy land, a kind of counterfactual world. And so the contrast between the veniunt and the ut variant is somewhat clever by Ovid, because for Ovid, as for Freud many centuries later, most people are not rational but live in blind desire for attention, hence the attention culture that Ovid so brilliantly anticipates as regards our own day as well. So women always come to the games so that they may see. Okay, so women always come to the games so that they may see the games and that they themselves may also be seen. So kind of play between the objective and the subjective. And then this is, of course, you may recognize this as the first line in Virgil's The Aeneid, perhaps the greatest literary text in Latin. Arma virumque cano qui primus eletoribus Troiae ad Itellium venit. So I sing, here he's talking about the poet himself. Many people think this might be about Caesar Augustus, but certainly the language and text can stand in terms of its literary achievement as well. So I sing, literally about arms and about a man, but sometimes this is translated as I sing of arms and of a man, even though both these endings are in the accusative, not in the genitive. So this is second declension, neuter, accusative plural, and this is simply second declension, accusative singular. The man in question is Aeneas, who after the Trojan War left the fall of Troy and of course sails and eventually makes his way to Italy to found a new Troy, in this, which is suggested to be Rome itself. So I sing about arms and a man who first came from the shores of Troy to Italy. Who first came from the shores eletoribus of Troy to Italy. Let's see. We don't normally do the shorter ones, but this one's actually pretty funny. Perhaps some of you could relate in terms of social media or texting. I think in one sense human nature doesn't really change, only its spectacle. And you'll see what I mean by that in just a moment. So, cur non mito meos tibi pontili ane libelos ne mihi tu mites pontili ane tuos. So why, and again, you do have some help down here in terms of some of the vocab, which is also continued on the next page. But why do I not send to you my books? So why do I not, non mito, send to you my books, libelos pataliene, lest or so that you don't send your books, pataline, to me? So I think that's pretty funny. Let's be honest, we've all had maybe somebody who has sent us an email or a text message or contacted us via social media. And you know that if you respond, they're likely to respond back. Sad but true. But you can see that social dynamic is nothing new to our social media age, but it tends to be deeper in terms of human desire for attention and recognition. All right, moving on to the last long passage of the semester. We have the Spanish writer Saint Isidore, Bishop of Seville. Was a polymath, best known for his 20-volume work, the Origenes or Etymologiae, which is interesting. So this would be the Latin, this would be the Greek. It shows you the importance of Greece and Greek for Latin and Rome and Christianity. As you may know, St. Paul himself was a kind of quasi-Greek philosopher. But so this is an interesting text. I would encourage you to read all 20 volumes over the Christmas break. So please take a look at this, and it also gives us a lot of helpful vocabulary. This one's not too difficult, even though it's longer. It's basically about the days of the week, and once you get going in this passage, you can see it becomes fairly intuitive because it simply just goes over Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So what we have is the days have been named or are called by the gods. Dikti can also means are called or are named. So the days are named, literally have been named, from the gods whose names the Romans had dedicated to certain stars. So the days are named literally from the gods whose names the Romans dedicated to certain stars. So had dedicated to certain stars. So notice stars is first declension, ablative plural, is. For the first day, so here we have to recognize that both these endings are in the accusative. So they called, and of course they is referring back to the Romans. They called, or for they named the first day literally from the sun, or after the sun would be, I guess, also possible. Probably sounds a little bit better to say after the sun, but literally from the sun. From the sun is interesting because this is a little bit speculative, but for the Romans, as for the Greeks, and certainly the Christians, it wasn't human beings who named or created the sun, it was God himself. So there's this idea is that they called the first day from the sun because the sun existed long before man and his consciousness and his knowledge, not to mention his science. And so from the sun, I think, expresses the Latin a little bit better, but it just sounds a little bit awkward in contemporary American English to say, for the first day they named from the sun, where it sounds a little bit more natural to say, for the first day they named after the sun. For the first day they named after the sun, which is literally is the first, literally is the prince, rather the first, which is the first of all stars. So which is the first of all stars. Now here we have our purpose clause. So here's where you might want to say, notice how to doesn't quite work in this case. You have to maybe intuitively or go back to look at your examples. Is so that works, I think, the best in this particular context. You have to go back to this and trial and error, see which one sounds the best for your translation. So that literally the same day is the foremost among all these other days. So this is probably a little interesting. I believe this is a preposition. So followed by, so is the foremost before all the other stars. And so you have to experiment with different ways to translate that. Here, notice that these are both in the ablative. So if we go back to Whitaker's words, we're going to use this preposition followed by the ablative. And so is the foremost among all the other stars. Interestingly enough, and we kind of know this, but we often say that Sunday is the seventh day. But of course, we know it's, in one sense, the first day or the most important day. So notice how the Latin in Isidore's text often reminds us of that. So we often call Monday the first day. Well, it's the first day of the work week because modern life is organized around work, whereas a religious life would be organized around Sunday. So probably makes much more sense, certainly from a Christian perspective, to call Sunday the first day of the week. The second day, once again, we need to recognize the and diem. This is the accusative direct object. So they named the second day from the moon, which literally receives light from the sun. That one's fairly straightforward, which receives light. Light is third declension, accusative singular, blank east EMA, from the sun. The third, in other words, the third day, the tertium diem. The third day is so-called literally from the star Mars, or in this case from the star Mars, which is called the evening star. Oftentimes Mars is still visible in the evening sky, whereas other stars might depend on their position in the sky. So the third from the star Mars is called, a third from the star Mars, from the star of Mars, which is named the night. So this one we have to kind of fill in a little bit more of the language based on that. So we might have something, the third star is named after the star of Mars, which is called the evening star, or something like that. The fourth, there was the quartum diem, is so-called from the star of Mercury, but literally the fourth from the star of Mercury. So you can see we have to fill that in, and that's why I said in my translation, the fourth day they named after the star of Mercury. In fact, that might make more sense because then we're following the longer sentences at the beginning of this passage. The fifth, the quintum diem, they named after the star of Jove. The sixth after the star of Venus, which they called literally the light star, Lucifer, the light bringer. This is where, if you look over here, they give us some possible, or the morning star, which they called the morning star, which among all the stars has more light. So which inter omnes steles, which among all the stars has habet more light, plurimum lucis, literally more of light, because lucis is genitive. But more of light, more light. The seventh, there was a septimum diem, the seventh day, they named after the star of Saturn, which is said to be, now here we have the present passive, which we had earlier in the semester, which is said to literally to explere, I think that's one of our vocabulary words. It means to complete. Oh yeah, there, I just went past it, I think. Oops, I could use this here. So to fill up or to complete. I think we also had this in the Trojan horse passage from Virgil as well, this couple chapters ago. But in this case, probably complete. To complete its course in the heavens is the idea here. Which is said to complete, so there's our infinitive, which is said to complete its course in 30 years. Which is said to complete its course in 30 years. Among the Hebrews, going back to the Old Testament, but among the Hebrews, so alta means but, the first day is called the Sabbath day. So, but among the Hebrews, the first day is called literally the day of Sabbath. The day of Sabbath is called the Sabbath day, which among us, in other words, among us Christians, in contrast to the Old Testament, which among us is called the Day of the Lord. It's called the Lord's Day, which the pagans had dedicated to the sun. So this sentence here is kind of interesting because Saint Isidora is kind of contrasting Christians and Romans and Jews and the languages and how the languages and their understanding of the universe different and evolved, as civilization and language changed. So it's kind of an interesting sentence here on many levels. But the Sabbath, ad Dominico es, but the Sabbath literally is the seventh day from the Lord, which the pagans had dedicated to Saturn. So this one is the direct object here. But the day of the Sabbath is 7 days from, hold on here, Sabitum, is that? No. Okay, there we go. I'm just not too familiar with the vocab as well. So this one actually is a neuter noun, so it is the subject. So, but the Sabbath is the first day. So here they're giving us help with the translation because this one is a little bit tricky perhaps just because it's less familiar. But the Sabbath is the first day after the Sabbath from the Lord. Or rather, but the Sabbath is the first day after the Sabbath of the Lord. In fact, they give us the entire translation here if we just follow this here. But the Sabbath is the first day after the Sabbath of the Lord. All right, so you can see once you go through that, it's fairly straightforward, but an interesting text, and again, 20 volumes. Again, this is a major work of Christian theology and classical Christian education. And if you ever get a chance to read some of it, I'm sure all of it has been translated into English as well. It'll get you thinking about education and a lot of other things. All right, well, that is it for the Latin and the Wheelocks for this semester. And I will, of course, be sending out an email about the last test and the final exam and about what both those tests will look like. Happy Thanksgiving.